You think you know the person sleeping next to you until the day they pack your bags and replace you with a 24-year-old Instagram model. David thought his wife Evelyn was just a boring, sweatpant-wearing homebody dragging him down. He threw away an 8-year marriage for a shiny new trophy, completely unaware that the boring woman he just kicked out was about to become the ruthless CEO signing his paychecks. The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Seattle penthouse, casting a harsh light on what David Henderson considered the greatest tragedy of his life, his marriage. David adjusted his custom-tailored Tom Ford tie in the mirror, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. At 34, he was the director of marketing at Apex Innovations, a rapidly growing tech firm. He was handsome, ambitious, and on the fast track to a vice president title. He was a man who commanded rooms, a man who belonged at the top of the food chain. Then he looked over at the kitchen island. There sat his wife, Evelyn. She was 33, but in David's eyes, she might as well have been 60. She was draped in an oversized, faded grey cardigan that looked like it had survived a war. Her hair was pulled up into a messy bun held together by a plastic claw clip, and a pair of thick, blue light-blocking glasses slid down the bridge of her nose. She was aggressively typing on a battered silver laptop, an empty mug of black tea resting beside her. "Are you going to wear that all day again?" David asked, unable to keep the sneer out of his voice. Evelyn didn't even look up from her screen. "I have a lot of data to crunch today, David. Comfort is key when you're staring at spreadsheets for 9 hours." David sighed dramatically, grabbing his Italian leather briefcase. "Right. Spreadsheets. Freelance accounting. Truly riveting stuff, Evelyn. You know Greg Mitchell and his wife are hosting a charity gala this weekend. I need a +1 who looks like she belongs in a ballroom, not a nursing home." Evelyn's fingers paused on the keyboard. For a fraction of a second, a sharp, unreadable glint flashed behind her thick lenses. But just as quickly, it vanished, replaced by her usual placid expression. "I'm busy this weekend anyway. You should go alone. Network. Be the star you are," David scoffed, turning on his heel. "I always am." As the heavy oak door clicked shut behind him, David felt the familiar weight of resentment settle on his chest. They had met 8 years ago in college. Back then, Evelyn's quiet intelligence had been endearing. She was grounded, practical, and a stabilizing force, while David chased his wild ambitions. But as David climbed the corporate ladder, Evelyn had seemingly stagnated. She insisted on working from home, doing freelance financial consulting for clients she never talked about. She never asked for money which David appreciated, but she also refused to dress the part of an executive's wife. She drove a 5-year-old Volvo. She bought her clothes off the rack. She was, in a word, boring. David wanted a woman who was a status symbol, a woman who made other men jealous. Enter Tiffany Lawson. Tiffany was 24, a former pageant queen, and the new social media manager at Apex Innovations. She had a body sculpted by Pilates, a wardrobe funded by credit card debt, and a master's degree in manipulation. From the moment she stepped into David's office, smelling of expensive perfume, and flashing a brilliant, perfectly veneered smile, David was hooked. Their affair had started 3 months ago, entirely by cliché. Late nights at the office, drinks after a successful pitch, and finally a hotel room downtown. Tiffany made David feel like a god. She hung on to his every word, traced his jawline with her manicured acrylic nails, and whispered about how a man as powerful as him deserved a woman who could keep up. "Your wife just doesn't understand your genius, Davy." Tiffany purred later that afternoon, sitting on the edge of David's mahogany desk. She was wearing a crimson pencil skirt that left nothing to the imagination. "You're a shark. You need someone who can swim in the deep end with you. not someone anchored to the shallow end. David looked at Tiffany, intoxicated by her youth and her blatant worship of him. She was right. He had outgrown Evelyn. He was carrying dead weight, and it was time to cut the cord. He had given Evelyn his 20s, but his 30s belonged to him. It was time to upgrade his life. David meticulously planned the execution. He wanted it to be clean, swift, and entirely on his terms. He chose a Friday evening. When he arrived back at the penthouse, Evelyn was in the exact same spot at the kitchen island, though she had traded her tea for a glass of tap water. The glowing screen of her laptop reflected off her glasses. "Pack your bags," David said, tossing his keys onto the marble entryway table. His voice was cold, rehearsed. Evelyn finally looked up, her expression mildly confused. "Are we going somewhere I told you? I have a massive merger. I mean, a massive project to review this weekend." "No, Evelyn. You are going somewhere." David stepped fully into the room, unbuttoning his suit jacket. "I want a divorce. I want you out of this apartment by tonight." The silence in the room was deafening. The only sound was the distant hum of the Seattle traffic below. David braced himself for the hysterics. He expected tears, screaming, perhaps a plate thrown at his head. He had his speech ready about how they had drifted apart, how she didn't support his lifestyle, how he would be generous with the legal fees. Instead, Evelyn simply closed her laptop. The gentle click echoed loudly. She took off her glasses, folding them deliberately, and looked at David. Her hazel eyes, usually warm and soft, were suddenly piercing. It was a look David had never seen before, analytical, calculating, and utterly devoid of panic. "Tonight?" she asked, her voice dangerously calm. "After 8 years, you are kicking me out on a Friday night without warning. There's no point in dragging this out." David crossed his arms, puffing out his chest. "I've outgrown this marriage, Evelyn. You've let yourself go. You have no ambition. You sit in here all day in those hideous sweaters, clicking away at a screen, making pennies. I'm going places. I need a partner who reflects my success." "A partner," Evelyn repeated softly. "Like Tiffany Lawson?" David froze. The blood drained from his face. "How do you—" "I may work from home, David, but I am not blind, nor am I stupid." Evelyn stood up, smoothing down her grey cardigan. "I saw the charge for the Diamond Suite at the Fairmont Hotel on the joint credit card last month, and the receipt for the Cartier bracelet in your coat pocket last week. You're not nearly as clever as you think you are." David recovered quickly, masking his shock with arrogance. "Fine. Yes. Tiffany and I are together. She makes me feel alive. She has drive. She cares about how she presents herself to the world. She's moving in here tomorrow. So I suggest you start packing your boxes." Evelyn stared at him. For a moment, David thought he saw a flicker of genuine amusement cross her face, a slight curling of her lip that almost looked like a smirk, but it was gone in a flash. "Moving in here," Evelyn stated, looking around the expansive $3 million penthouse. "I see. My name is on the lease, Evelyn. I pay the rent," David said proudly. It was true he wrote the check every month to the property management company. "Right. You pay the rent?" Evelyn nodded slowly. She walked over to the hall closet and pulled out a single, sleek, black suitcase. It wasn't a cheap canvas bag. It was an expensive, hard-shell Rimowa. David frowned, not remembering when she bought that. Without shedding a single tear, Evelyn walked into the master bedroom. David followed, hovering in the doorway, suddenly feeling deeply unsettled by her lack of emotion. She packed methodically, leaving behind the cheap sweaters and taking only a few specific items, her laptop and a locked metal briefcase from the back of the closet that David had never noticed before. "You don't want to fight for this?" David asked, almost offended by how easy she was making it. 8 yours, and you're just going to roll over. Evelyn zipped the suitcase shut. She stood up and walked toward the bedroom door, stopping mere inches from David. He suddenly realized that while she was shorter than him, she carried a presence that made the room feel incredibly small. "David," Evelyn said, her voice dropping to a low, chilling register. "I never fight battles that are already won. You want this life. You can have it. But remember this moment. Remember that you demanded this." She walked past him, her suitcase rolling smoothly over the hardwood floor. At the front door, she paused. "Oh, and David, tell Tiffany I hope she enjoys the view. It won't last forever." The heavy door slammed shut. David let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. He shook his head, brushing off the weird encounter. She was just trying to sound dramatic to save face. He pulled out his phone and dialed Tiffany's number. "Hey, babe." David smiled, looking out at the city skyline. "The trash has been taken out. Pack your bags. You're moving into the penthouse." 3 months later, the illusion of David's perfect new life was beginning to crack, and the fractures were getting expensive. Moving Tiffany into the penthouse had been a thrilling victory for the first 2 weeks. She filled the space with vibrant energy, loud pop music, and endless deliveries of designer clothes. But reality soon set in with a brutal swiftness. Tiffany didn't cook. She ordered Nobu and caviar delivery. She didn't clean. She insisted David hire a maid service that cost triple what he was used to. And the rent, the exorbitant rent David had always proudly paid, suddenly felt like an anvil on his chest. Back when Evelyn lived there, David paid the rent, but Evelyn had quietly paid for all the utilities, the groceries, the insurance, and the car payments from her freelance work. David hadn't realized how much financial weight Evelyn had been pulling until she was gone. Now his credit cards were maxed out. His savings were dwindling. But he couldn't let Tiffany know. He had to maintain the image of the wealthy, high-rolling executive. Tiffany whined one Tuesday morning, holding up her phone while lounging on the imported Italian leather sofa. She was wearing silk pajamas that cost more than David's first car. "The girls and I are planning a trip to Tulum next month. I need you to book the villa. It's only 25 grand for the week." David swallowed the lump of panic in his throat. 25 grand. He didn't even have 5 grand in his checking account. "Babe, I'm in the middle of a massive corporate restructure right now. My funds are tied up in stock options. Maybe we can do Tulum next year." Tiffany's pout deepened into a scowl. "You promised me a lifestyle, David. Don't tell me you're suddenly broke." "I'm not broke," David snapped immediately, regretting his tone when Tiffany's eyes narrowed. He forced a smile. "I'm just being liquid conscious. Look, a massive promotion is coming my way. You know Apex Innovations is being acquired, right? Once the dust settles, I'll be named VP. The bonus alone will pay for 10 trips to Tulum." Mollified by the promise of future wealth, Tiffany went back to scrolling her Instagram feed. David quickly grabbed his briefcase and hurried out the door, his stomach churning with anxiety. The acquisition of Apex Innovations was the talk of the corporate world. Apex, a mid-sized tech and marketing firm, was suddenly being swallowed whole by a notoriously aggressive private equity firm known as Veritas Capital. Veritas Capital was an absolute leviathan. They bought underperforming companies, gutted the useless management, optimized the operations, and turned massive profits. The terrifying part was their leadership. The public face of the firm was a charismatic shark named Michael Carter, the Chief Operations Officer. But everyone in the financial sector knew Carter answered to a mysterious founder and CEO, a shadow player who never gave interviews, never appeared in the press, and ruled their empire with an iron fist. Wall Street referred to this elusive figure simply as the architect. When David arrived at the Apex Innovations office building, the atmosphere was chaotic. Employees were whispering in huddles by the water coolers. Desks were already being cleared out. Veritas Capital was wasting no time. The purging had begun. David confidently strode past the nervous underlings and headed straight for the executive floor. He wasn't worried. He was David Henderson. He had overseen the highest-performing marketing campaign of the fiscal year. He was untouchable. He walked into the office of Greg Mitchell, the current CEO of Apex. Greg was a man in his late 50s, usually boisterous and confident. But today, he looked like he hadn't slept in a week. He was frantically shredding documents. "Greg, what's the panic?" David asked, taking a seat in the leather chair opposite the desk, crossing his legs casually. "The transition team from Veritas is arriving today, right? We should be rolling out the red carpet, not acting like we're on the Titanic." Greg stopped shredding and looked at David with bloodshot eyes. "You don't get it, David. Veritas doesn't do red carpets. They do firing squads. Michael Carter just emailed me. The architect is coming today. Personally. They are touring the building and evaluating the executive suite face to face." David's eyebrows shot up. "The architect. The secret CEO coming here." "Yes?" Greg ran a trembling hand over his face. "And word on the street is they despise bloated marketing budgets. They are completely restructuring your department. You need to be on your absolute best behavior today, David. No arrogance, no grandstanding. You bow your head, you present your analytics, and you pray to God they don't fire you on the spot." David felt a prickle of irritation. He didn't bow his head for anyone. "Relax, Greg. Whoever this architect is, they respect results. And I deliver results. I'll charm them. Hell, by the end of the day, they'll probably fire you and put me in your chair." Greg stared at David, utterly appalled by his hubris. "You are a fool, David, a monumental fool. Go to your office and prepare your files. They will be on this floor in 1 hour. David returned to his glass-walled office, feeling a surge of adrenaline. This was it. This was his moment to shine. He adjusted his tie, pulled up his most impressive pie charts on his monitors, and waited. He imagined the architect as some grumpy, grey-haired Wall Street veteran in a pinstripe suit. He knew exactly how to speak their language. An hour later, a heavy silence fell over the bustling executive floor. It was as if all the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. Through the glass walls of his office, David watched the elevator doors ping open. First stepped out a team of severe-looking lawyers in dark suits. Then came Michael Carter, the famous COO of Veritas Capital, holding a sleek tablet and looking around the office like he was inspecting a slaughterhouse. And then, stepping out from behind Michael Carter, was the CEO, the architect. David leaned forward in his chair, straining his neck to get a good look at the legend. The CEO was wearing a devastatingly sharp-tailored black power suit that screamed thousands of dollars. The posture was impeccable, commanding absolute authority. The CEO walked with a predatory grace, flanked by two burly security guards. As the group moved closer down the hallway, the CEO turned their head to speak to Michael Carter. David's heart stopped dead in his chest. The blood rushed to his ears, creating a deafening, roaring sound. The pie charts on his monitors suddenly blurred. He stood up so fast his chair rolled backward and slammed into the window. The thick blue light glasses were gone. The messy bun was replaced by a sleek, professional blowout. The faded grey cardigan was replaced by Prada. But the face was unmistakable. It was Evelyn. David stood frozen behind the glass wall of his office, his breath catching in his throat like a jagged piece of glass. His mind violently rejected the visual information his eyes were feeding him. It was a hallucination, a stress-induced waking nightmare brought on by the impending corporate takeover. It had to be. But as the entourage moved closer, stopping just outside the main executive boardroom, the undeniable reality settled over him like a suffocating blanket. The way she tilted her head when Michael Carter spoke to her. The precise, calculated nod she gave in response. The sharp, analytical hazel eyes that scanned the terrified employees. It was Evelyn. The boring woman he had kicked out of his home 3 months ago was the architect, the billionaire mastermind behind Veritas Capital. "Henderson." A panicked whisper hissed from the doorway. David flinched, snapping his head to see Greg Mitchell leaning in his face the color of old parchment. "They're calling us in. The main boardroom." "Now," Greg stammered, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead with a monogrammed handkerchief. "Get your files. And for the love of God, don't say a word unless you're spoken to." David mechanically reached for his iPad. His fingers numb. His mind was a chaotic whirlwind of fragmented memories. Evelyn typing furiously at the kitchen island. Freelance financial consulting. The locked metal briefcase. "I never fight battles that are already won." He had thought she was balancing spreadsheets for local bakeries. She had been orchestrating multi-million-dollar corporate acquisitions. She hadn't been stagnant. She had been operating on a level so far above him, he couldn't even see the stratosphere she occupied. The walk down the hallway felt like a death march. The executive boardroom of Apex Innovations was a massive, ultra-modern glass box suspended in the center of the floor, designed to project transparency and power. Right now it felt like an aquarium where the fish were about to be fed to a great white shark. David took his usual seat halfway down the long mahogany table, trying to control the visible shaking of his hands by gripping the edge of the wood. The other department heads filed in, looking equally nauseous. Then she entered. Evelyn walked to the head of the table. She didn't sit immediately. She stood there, her posture perfectly erect, her tailored black blazer emphasizing a commanding silhouette he had never noticed beneath those oversized cardigans. The 2 massive security guards took positions by the doors. Michael Carter, the feared COO, who had decimated dozens of companies, stood slightly behind her right shoulder, looking like an obedient attack dog waiting for a command. For a terrifying 5 seconds, Evelyn simply looked at the men and women seated around the table. Her eyes washed over David without a single flicker of recognition. It was as if she were looking at a moderately interesting piece of office furniture. The complete absence of emotion terrified him, more than if she had smiled. "Good morning." Evelyn's voice cut through the silence. It was smooth, authoritative, and chillingly calm. "For those who are unaware, my name is Evelyn Harrington. I am the founder and CEO of Veritas Capital. Effective as of 8 a.m. this morning, Veritas has acquired a controlling 78% stake in Apex Innovations." She finally sat down, folding her hands elegantly on the polished wood. "I do not believe in lengthy transitional periods. I do not believe in corporate synergy retreats. I believe in efficiency profitability and excising dead weight. Michael, if you please." Michael Carter stepped forward, tapping his tablet. The massive screens on the wall flickered to life, displaying a dizzying array of financial charts that looked distinctly like the ones Evelyn used to stare at over her morning tea. "Apex Innovations has been bleeding capital for 6 consecutive quarters," Michael stated bluntly, his voice echoing in the glass room. "Your overhead is bloated, your client retention is dropping, and your executive compensation packages are frankly a comedic tragedy given your performance." Evelyn turned her gaze to Greg Mitchell. The current CEO looked like he might actually vomit into the decorative fern next to him. "Mr. Mitchell," Evelyn said softly. Yes, Ms. Harrington," Greg squeaked. You spearheaded the acquisition of the Synergetics platform last year, a $20 million investment. Evelyn noted her eyes locked onto his. You projected a 40% increase in user engagement. Actual data shows a 3% decline, while server maintenance costs have tripled. Can you explain this catastrophic misallocation of funds? Greg scrambled, opening a thick binder. Well, you see, the market shifted unexpectedly, and the integration process encountered unforeseen technical roadblocks that— "Stop," Evelyn commanded. The word wasn't shouted, but it possessed enough force to make Greg snap his mouth shut instantly. Market shifts are predictable to anyone paying attention. Technical roadblocks are the result of poor due diligence. You gambled $20 million of company capital because you wanted a shiny press release in Forbes, not because the underlying infrastructure supported the acquisition. She leaned back in her chair. Your severance package has been voided due to gross negligence, as outlined in the stipulations of the acquisition contract. Security will escort you to your office to collect your personal effects. You are dismissed. A collective gasp echoed around the table. In less than 3 minutes, the CEO of the company had been fired, stripped of his golden parachute, and publicly humiliated. Greg opened his mouth to protest, but the 2 security guards were already stepping forward. With a look of utter defeat, Greg stood up and walked out of the room. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with terror. Now. Evelyn said, her eyes panning down the table until they landed squarely on David. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Let us discuss the marketing department. David's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He forced a confident smile, reverting to his default defense mechanism, unearned arrogance. He stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. Miss Harrington. David began pouring on the charm that usually won over clients. He purposefully used her surname, hoping she would appreciate his professionalism. David Henderson, Director of Marketing. I think you'll find that while the rest of the company has struggled, my department has been the shining star of Apex. Our recent Q3 campaign generated a 200% increase in social media impressions. He expected a glimmer of acknowledgement, a smirk, anything. Instead, Evelyn just stared at him. She didn't look at a screen or a file. She looked directly into his soul. Impressions, she repeated, tasting the word as if it were sour. A 200% increase in impressions. Mr. Henderson, what is your conversion rate on those impressions? David hesitated. Well, brand awareness is a long-term play. The conversion pipeline takes time to mature. What is the conversion rate, Mr. Henderson? She asked again, her voice dropping a fraction of an octave. David swallowed hard. 0.4%. Evelyn didn't blink. So you spent $3.5 million of the company's operating budget to generate likes, retweets, and meaningless digital applause, while less than 0.5% of those individuals actually purchased our enterprise software. Software, I might add, that costs $50,000 a license, making it entirely irrelevant to the teenage demographic your campaign targeted. Someone down the table coughed nervously. David felt a hot flush of embarrassment crawl up his neck. The campaign was widely praised by industry publications. David argued weakly, his charm evaporating. I am not interested in industry praise. I am interested in revenue, Evelyn countered sharply. Your department is a vortex of wasted capital. You prioritize aesthetics over analytics. You throw lavish parties disguised as networking events, and you expense luxury dinners under the guise of client acquisition when our client list has shrunk by 12% under your tenure. She had done her homework. Of course she had. She had lived with him. She knew exactly how he operated. David gripped the table. I built this department from the ground up. I know what I'm doing, If you just let me show you my 5-year projection. I have seen enough of your projections to know they are works of fiction, Evelyn interrupted cold. You fancy yourself a visionary Mr. Henderson, a regular Jordan Belfort of the tech marketing world. But vision without execution is just hallucination. And right now you are costing me money. David braced himself for the killing blow. He waited for the words, "You are dismissed." He wondered how quickly he could clear out his desk before security dragged him out like Greg. But Evelyn leaned forward, resting her chin on her steepled fingers. A microscopic, almost imperceptible smirk finally ghosted across her lips. It was the exact same smirk she had given him the night he kicked her out. "However," Evelyn said slowly, "firing you would be too easy. It would allow you to avoid cleaning up the catastrophic mess you've made. And I abhor a mess." David blinked, thoroughly confused. I'm not fired." "No," Evelyn replied smoothly. "You are demoted. Effective immediately, you are stripped of your director title. Your corporate expense account is terminated. Your discretionary budget is reduced to 0. You will now hold the title of Junior Analytics Coordinator." David's jaw dropped. Junior Analytics Coordinator. That was an entry-level position. It was a job for fresh college graduates who fetched coffee and formatted Excel spreadsheets. Furthermore, Evelyn continued, her voice echoing with finality, "Your entire department is being restructured. The social media management team is being dissolved entirely. We do not need a team of 5 people posting memes to generate a 0.4% conversion rate. Those employees will be given their notices today." David's mind scrambled. The social media team. That was Tiffany. Evelyn was firing Tiffany. "You can't do that," David blurted out, losing his composure completely. The room gasped at his audacity. "You can't just fire the social media team. They are essential to our modern branding." Evelyn's eyes narrowed into terrifying slits. "I assure you, Mr. Henderson, I can do whatever I please with my company. Your former social media manager, Miss Lawson, I believe her metrics are the worst in the division. She spends more time utilizing company studio equipment for her personal influencer accounts than she does promoting Apex products. She is terminated." Evelyn stood up, signaling the end of the massacre. "You have 24 hours to transition your files to the new interim director. You will report to the basement analytics bullpen on Monday morning. If you fail to meet the performance quotas of your new role, you will be terminated with cause voiding any remaining stock options you think you possess. Welcome to Veritas Capital, Mr. Henderson." Without another word, Evelyn Harrington turned and walked out of the glass boardroom, her security detail trailing closely behind. David sank slowly back into his chair, the world spinning wildly out of control. He had walked into this room as a king. He was leaving it as a peasant, ruled by the very queen he had thrown away. The hours following the boardroom slaughter were a blur of chaos and humiliation. David sat in his glass-walled office, soon to be someone else's office, watching his empire crumble. Outside his door, the marketing floor was in a state of pandemonium. The Veritas transition team moved with ruthless efficiency, handing out thick manila envelopes to nearly half the staff. David watched through the glass as Tiffany Lawson, wearing a hot pink designer dress that looked wildly out of place amidst the corporate execution, was handed her envelope. She opened it, read the contents, and let out an ear-piercing shriek of indignation. She stomped her expensive stiletto heel through the papers at the impassive HR representative and stormed toward David's office. David quickly turned away, staring intensely at a blank wall, praying she wouldn't come in. He couldn't face her right now. He couldn't face the reality of what this meant for their lifestyle. Thankfully, 2 security guards intercepted Tiffany before she reached his door, escorting her forcefully toward the elevators, while she screamed obscenities about wrongful termination. At 6 p.m., the office was a ghost town. David finally packed his personal belongings into a small cardboard box. No Italian leather briefcase. Just a pathetic brown box. He took the elevator down to the parking garage, his hands trembling as he unlocked his leased BMW. The drive home to the penthouse felt like a funeral procession. The Seattle rain began to fall, slicking the neon-lit streets. His mind raced, doing frantic mental math. His salary was just slashed by 70%. The junior analytics coordinator role paid a pittance. His stock options, which he had banked on to pay off his mounting credit card debt, were now held hostage by his performance in a role he had no idea how to do. The rent for the penthouse was due in exactly 9 days. $3,500. He didn't even have $800. When he keyed into the penthouse, the air was thick with the smell of expensive cannabis and loud, pulsing electronic music. David dropped his cardboard box on the marble entryway table and walked into the living room. Tiffany was sprawled on the Italian leather sofa, surrounded by 3 of her equally manicured, surgically enhanced friends. Empty bottles of Veuve Clicquot champagne littered the glass coffee table. "Turn that down," David commanded, his voice raspy from stress. Tiffany rolled her eyes, taking a drag from a sleek vape pen before lazily tapping a remote to lower the volume. Finally. "You're home. Tell me you fixed this, Davy. Tell me you told that psycho new CEO that I'm untouchable." David stared at the empty champagne bottles. "How did you pay for this, Tiffany?" "With your black card, obviously," she scoffed, gesturing to his corporate credit card sitting on the table. "I was stressed, David. I needed to decompress. I was literally escorted out of the building like a criminal. My followers are going to be horrified when I post about this toxic work environment." A cold sweat broke out across David's forehead. "You used my corporate card today, after the acquisition. So what?" Tiffany whined, sitting up and crossing her arms. "You're the VP, right? You said the bonus was coming. Who cares about a few bottles of champagne?" "I'm not the VP." David finally snapped the dam of his composure, completely breaking. He grabbed the corporate card off the table. "I was demoted. I am a junior analytics coordinator. My salary is gone. The bonus is gone. The entire marketing budget is gone. We have no money. Tiffany." The room went dead silent. The 3 friends on the sofa awkwardly looked at their phones, desperately trying to avoid eye contact. Tiffany stood up slowly, her pout vanishing, replaced by a look of sheer, calculating disgust. "What do you mean you have no money?" "I mean I can't pay the rent next week." David ran a hand through his hair, pulling at the roots. "I can't pay for the Tulum trip. I can't pay for the maid service. Evelyn, the new CEO is Evelyn Tiffany. She bought the company. She planned this." Tiffany blinked, processing the information with terrifying speed. The youthful adoration that usually filled her eyes when she looked at him evaporated instantly. "Wait. Your boring ex-wife is the billionaire who just bought Apex, and she fired me, and she demoted you." "Yes," David yelled, pacing the floor. "She set me up. We need to downsize. Immediately. We have to sell the furniture, break the lease, maybe move into a cheaper place in the suburbs until I can figure out a way to get my stock options." "Stop right there." Tiffany held up a manicured hand, her voice suddenly devoid of any affection. "We are not doing anything. You are downsizing." David stopped pacing. "What? Did you honestly think I was going to move to the suburbs with a junior analytics coordinator?" Tiffany laughed, a harsh, grating sound. She turned to her friends. "Girls, grab your bags. We're going to the W Hotel." "Tiffany, wait." David stepped forward, his stomach dropping. "You love me. You said I was a shark. You said we were a team." Tiffany picked up her designer purse, looking at David as if he were a piece of gum stuck to the bottom of her shoe. "You were a shark, Davy. Now you're just chum. And I don't do broke." She walked past him, her friends scurrying behind her like frightened mice. The heavy oak door slammed shut, echoing identically to the way it had when Evelyn left 3 months ago. David collapsed onto the sofa, burying his face in his hands. He was utterly, completely alone. The weekend was an agonizing blur of cheap whiskey and panic attacks. By Monday morning, David looked 10 years older. He wore an older, less tailored suit, too terrified to ruin his expensive ones now that he couldn't afford dry cleaning. He bypassed the executive elevator and took the standard lift down to the basement level. The analytics bullpen was a windowless, fluorescent-lit dungeon filled with rows of grey cubicles. The air smelled of stale coffee and printer ozone. He found his cubicle. It was barely large enough to fit a chair and a standard-issue desktop computer. No glass walls, no city view. He sat down, feeling a crushing weight of despair. But the nightmare wasn't over. At 10 a.m., his desk phone, a cheap plastic landline, rang. "Henderson," David answered dully. "David Henderson. This is Jonathan Hayes." A clipped nasal voice spoke through the receiver. "I am the lead forensic auditor for Veritas Capital. I need you in conference room 3B on the executive floor immediately." David's blood ran cold. An audit for what? "For your expense reports, spanning the last 24 months, Hayes replied smoothly. "Do not delay." The line clicked dead. David's legs felt like lead as he took the elevator back up to the top floor. The executive suite was unrecognizable. The relaxed, arrogant atmosphere of Greg Mitchell's reign was gone, replaced by a hyper-efficient, hushed intensity. Men and women in dark suits moved with purpose, speaking in low tones. David found conference room 3B. Sitting at the table was Jonathan Hayes, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and a deeply unpleasant smile. He had 3 massive binders stacked in front of him. "Sit, Mr. Henderson," Hayes instructed, not looking up from his tablet. David sat his hands, sweating so profusely he had to wipe them on his trousers. "Mr. Henderson, as part of the acquisition, Veritas conducts deep-dive audits into all executive discretionary spending." Hayes began opening the first binder. "Ms. Harrington specifically requested I expedite the audit on the marketing department, and I must say, what I've found is rather colorful. My budget was approved by Greg Mitchell," David said quickly, defensively. "Every cent was signed off. Mr. Mitchell's signature is currently worth less than the paper it's printed on," Hayes countered coldly. He slid a piece of paper across the table. "Let's look at this. Shall we A, charge for $12,000 to the Fairmont Hotel Diamond Suite, listed under Client Entertainment Tanaka Robotics?" David swallowed hard. That was the weekend he took Tiffany to the hotel, before he kicked Evelyn out. Tanaka Robotics is based in Tokyo. Hayes continued, his eyes piercing David. "Our flight logs show no executives from Tanaka were in Seattle that weekend. Furthermore, the room service receipts detail 2 bottles of Dom Perignon chocolate-covered strawberries and a couple's massage." Hayes tilted his head. "Did you provide a couple's massage for a Japanese robotics executive, Mr. Henderson?" David opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Hayes slid another paper over. "A charge for $8,500 at Cartier, listed under corporate gifting. We contacted the vendor. The item purchased was a diamond-encrusted love bracelet, size 16. That is a woman's piece. Which client received this gift?" Panic seized David's chest. He had given that bracelet to Tiffany for their 1-month anniversary. I can explain." David stammered, his mind racing for a lie, any lie. "There is no need to explain," Hayes said, closing the binder with a sharp thud. "The evidence of corporate embezzlement is overwhelming. You have systematically used company funds to finance a lavish personal lifestyle, defrauding Apex Innovations to the tune of nearly $150,000 over 2 years. David felt the room spinning. Embezzlement. That was a felony. That meant prison. What? What happens now? David whispered, his arrogant facade completely shattered. He was begging now. Hayes smiled thinly. "Ms. Harrington is a very thorough CEO, Mr. Henderson. She believes in holding individuals accountable for their actions. She is waiting for you in her office. She wishes to deliver the final verdict personally." Hayes stood up and gestured to the door. "Walk." David stood his knees, buckling slightly. He was being marched to the gallows. He stumbled down the hallway, passing his old glass-walled office, now occupied by a severe-looking woman rapidly typing on a laptop. He reached the heavy oak double doors of the main CEO suite, the same suite where he had confidently told Greg Mitchell he would charm the architect. The security guard opened the door. David walked in. The office was vast, with panoramic views of the Seattle skyline. Behind the massive mahogany desk sat Evelyn. She was wearing a perfectly tailored white suit today, looking like an absolute queen presiding over her conquered territory. She was typing on her silver laptop, the exact same one she used to use at the kitchen island. She didn't look up immediately. She let him stand there stewing in his terror, letting the silence stretch until David thought he might pass out. Finally, she closed the laptop with a soft click. She folded her hands, leaned back in her chair, and looked at the ruined, broken man standing before her. "Hello, David," Evelyn said softly. "It seems we have a lot to talk about." David stood paralyzed on the imported wool rug of the executive office. He stared at Evelyn, searching for a flicker of the woman who used to bake banana bread. There was nothing. The woman behind the massive desk possessed eyes like polished obsidian cold, reflective and impenetrable. "Have a seat," Evelyn instructed, her voice devoid of malice, which made it terrifying. She gestured to a leather chair across from her. David felt his legs turn to cement as he collapsed into the chair. He gripped the armrests. He opened his mouth to offer an apology, but his vocal cords failed him. "I imagine you are experiencing a profound paradigm shift." Evelyn began closing her silver laptop. "You spent 8 years convinced I was a complacent anchor holding you back. You thought my sweaters indicated a lack of drive." David swallowed the bile rising in his throat. "Evelyn, please. I did not know." "Because you never asked," she interrupted smoothly. "When I told you I managed freelance financial portfolios, I was actively restructuring distressed assets for private equity. When I was supposedly crunching spreadsheets, I was quietly building Veritas Capital into a massive acquisition engine. I didn't hide my success. You lacked the capacity to recognize it, because it did not look like an Italian silk tie." David felt a hot tear prick his eye. His own stupidity was crushing him. "Why let me believe a lie?" "Because your belief was convenient," Evelyn stated flatly. "Your arrogance provided perfect cover. While you were orchestrating bloated marketing campaigns and taking your young subordinate to luxury hotels on the company dime, I was conducting forensic analyses of the core property of this company. I realized this enterprise possessed valuable software, but it was being driven into the ground by an incompetent executive suite." She retrieved a folder and dropped it. The gold lettering read, "Perkins Coy Corporate Litigation." "This brings us to the matter at hand," Evelyn said, tapping her finger against the folder. "You have embezzled exactly $150,000 from this company over the past 2 full years. You categorized luxury jewelry as corporate gifting. You categorized hotel trysts as client entertainment. You utilized company resources to fund a fraudulent lifestyle. It was an industry standard, David pleaded, his voice cracking. Everyone at my level was doing it. Greg practically encouraged it. I can pay it back. Just give me my bonus. Let me cash out my vested stock and I will write a check today. Evelyn let out a short, hollow laugh. Your bonus, your stock. As of yesterday, your stock options are frozen. Given that you are investigated for felony fraud, those options are functionally worthless. She slid a dense, legal document across the polished wood toward him. Beside it, she placed a black fountain pen. You have two paths forward, Evelyn explained with clinical precision. Path 1 is simple. I hand this audit file to Perkins Coie. They will forward it to the district attorney. You will be indicted for corporate embezzlement. You will face a minimum of 5 years in federal prison. Your career will be permanently obliterated, and your life will end. David stared at the document, hyperventilating. And what is Path 2? He choked out. Path 2. Evelyn pointed to the bottom line of the paper. You sign this document. It is a full, legally binding confession of your financial misconduct. It contains an ironclad legal gag order regarding our relationship. Furthermore, it stipulates that you forfeit 100% of your vested stock options back to the company as partial restitution. That is almost $400,000 in equity. You cannot just take that. I am recovering stolen corporate assets, Evelyn corrected sharply. But the stock only covers a fraction of the damages you caused. To repay the remaining funds you stole, your wages will be aggressively garnished. You will remain in your newly appointed position as junior analytics coordinator in the basement. Every paycheck will be drained until the debt is settled. You want to keep me here, as an indentured servant. David was shaking violently, horror washing over him. I will just quit. I will file for bankruptcy. If you quit. Evelyn said, her voice dropping to a glacial whisper. The debt is called in immediately, and we revert to Path 1. The district attorney gets the criminal file. Furthermore, the document contains a global industry ban clause. You will be legally barred from working in the marketing sectors anywhere in North America for the next 10 years. You try to get a job at a competitor, my lawyers will bury you in litigation. She leaned back, crossing her arms. So, David, Path 1 or Path 2? The choice is yours. David looked down at the black pen. His hands were trembling so severely he was not sure he could hold it. He had played a very dangerous game of chess against a grandmaster, only to realize he had been the pawn all along. With a suffocating sob, David reached out. His fingers wrapped around the cold metal. He pulled the document closer, the legal jargon swimming before his completely wet eyes. He did not read it. He just pressed the nib to the paper and scrawled his signature on the dotted line, legally signing away his wealth, his freedom, and his dignity. Evelyn watched him without a single trace of pity. When he finished, she smoothly pulled the document back across the desk and closed the folder. A wise decision. Evelyn said, her voice entirely dismissive. Your shift in the basement begins at exactly dawn tomorrow morning. You are dismissed. David stood up on shaking legs. He turned and walked toward the heavy oak doors, a broken shell of the arrogant executive who had walked in. He was already forgotten. A closed file. David pushed the door open and stepped out into the hallway, the heavy wood clicking firmly shut behind him, sealing his fate forever. 6 months later, the relentless Seattle rain battered the single grimy window of David Henderson and his new apartment. It was not a penthouse. It was a 300-square-foot studio located above a noisy laundromat in a bleak industrial stretch of Linwood. The rent was cheap, which was an absolute necessity, because his bank account was a complete wasteland. The alarm clock on his battered nightstand blared aggressively at 4 in the morning. David groaned, swatting at the plastic device until the noise finally ceased. He sat on the edge of a lumpy mattress, rubbing his hands over a face that looked a decade older than his 34 years. Deep dark circles bruised the skin beneath his eyes, and his perfectly styled hair was unkempt and thinning. He stood up, shivering in the damp chill of the poorly insulated room. He walked into the tiny kitchenette, pouring tap water into a cheap plastic drip coffee maker. There was no luxury delivery anymore. His refrigerator contained half a loaf of generic white bread, processed cheese slices, and a single jar of yellow mustard. By 6 in the morning, David was standing on a crowded commuter bus, clutching a metal pole as the vehicle lurched through the sluggish morning traffic toward downtown Seattle. He was wearing a faded gray suit that hung loosely on his shrinking frame. When he arrived at the massive headquarters of Apex Innovations, he did not walk through the grand glass lobby. He used his employee keycard to enter through the subterranean loading dock, taking the service elevator down to the basement level. The analytics bullpen was exactly as depressing as it had been on day one. Rows of windowless cubicles hummed with the sound of cheap desktop fans and the frantic clicking of keyboards. David sat down at his cramped desk, logging into his computer. The screen immediately populated with thousands of rows of raw, unformatted data. This was his life now. 9 hours a day, formatting spreadsheets, running basic regression analysis, and generating reports that were sent up to the executive floors. His salary was abysmal, and due to the aggressive wage garnishment Evelyn had legally instituted, his actual take-home pay barely covered his rent, instant noodles, and a monthly bus pass. He was trapped in a financial purgatory of his own making. He could not quit. The legal agreement ensured that if he left, the remaining embezzlement debt would be instantly handed to a ruthless collections agency, and the 10-year non-compete clause made him virtually unemployable in any industry. At noon, David took his 30-minute mandated lunch break. He sat alone on a concrete bench in the underground parking garage, eating a squished cheese sandwich. He pulled out his cracked smartphone and mindlessly scrolled through social media, a toxic habit he could not quite break despite the pain it caused him. An algorithmically suggested video popped onto his feed. It was Tiffany Lawson. She was standing in a messy, poorly lit apartment kitchen, wearing cheap leggings. She was enthusiastically holding up a brightly colored plastic bottle of detox tea, reading a clearly scripted advertisement with a forced, desperate smile. Her follower count had plummeted since the Apex scandal. When she tried to sue Apex for wrongful termination, Evelyn Counter sued her for the theft of over $10,000 in company photography equipment she had secretly taken home. Tiffany had been forced to settle, liquidating her designer bags and moving into a miserable roommate situation to avoid jail. David watched her peddle the cheap laxative tea, feeling absolutely nothing. No anger, no love, just a hollow, empty void. He swiped past the video. The next item on his feed made his heart stop entirely. It was a promoted post from a major business magazine. The digital cover featured a high-resolution, stunningly professional portrait of Evelyn. She was wearing a razor-sharp charcoal power suit, her arms crossed confidently, a look of absolute, unyielding authority radiating from her hazel eyes. The headline below her name read, "The Architect Steps into the Light. How Evelyn Harrington Saved Apex Innovations." David clicked the link with trembling fingers. The piece detailed her brilliant acquisition strategy. It praised her for cutting out the bloated marketing department. The article concluded with a direct quote from Evelyn, taken from an interview conducted in her penthouse. "The greatest mistake a leader can make is mistaking volume for value." Evelyn was quoted as saying, "True power lies in recognizing the quiet foundational assets and having the courage to surgically remove the dead weight." David stared at the screen, the brutal words burning themselves into his mind. He had jumped into the deep end completely unaware that he was simply the dead weight she had let drown. And that is why you never judge a book by its cover, especially when that cover is plotting a multi-million-dollar corporate takeover right from your living room. David threw away a diamond to pick up a shiny rock, and now he's about to pay the ultimate price. Will Evelyn fire him on the spot? Will Tiffany drain his bank account before he even gets home? If you want to see the explosive showdown in the executive suite, smash that like button, hit subscribe, and share this video with someone who loves instant karma. Part 2 is coming soon. You won't want to miss it.